If anyone who's watching now needs to leave, this should be available later, or this will be available for people who aren't able to make it today. I'd like to welcome you all to the ALS 2020 Ballot Measure Breakdown Program. My name is Kristen Sterling, and I'm the current treasurer of Oregon Women Lawyers and also a member of the membership committee who is putting on today's program. ALS and its chapters often hold political forums around election time, but ALS itself is not a political organization and generally does not endorse political candidates or ballot measures. From time to time, we may issue position statements or take other policy and advocacy actions on issues directly affecting the legal profession and ALS members. But this event should not be construed as such an action by ALS other than encouragement to vote and be informed on the issues so you may vote the entire ballot. Many of you already have your ballots in hand, as the deadline to register to vote was on Tuesday, and ballots were mailed out starting Tuesday evening. I encourage everyone to vote early and track your ballots this election. Please use official drop boxes to return your ballots if you are able. Several counties have set up automatic notification systems to track your ballots, and all Oregon voters can check their ballots at the link that I'm going to put in your chat box. It's oregonvotes.gov/myvote. In today's program, we're covering statewide ballot measures, and we will have presenters on each ballot measure and time for Q&A following each set. Please add your questions to either the chat box or the Q&A box, and I'll make sure that they get asked of our panelists in due course. So first, we're going to look at ballot measure 107, which is a legislatively referred constitutional amendment that would amend the Oregon Constitution, allowing laws limiting political campaign contributions and expenditures, requiring disclosure of political campaign contributions and expenditures, and requiring political campaign advertisements to identify who paid for them. Joining us today to speak on this measure, we have Misha, Isaak, and Kelly Simon. Misha is currently a trial and appellate litigation partner at Perkins Coie, having previously served as general counsel to Governor Kate Brown. Kelly Simon is interim legal director for the ACLU of Oregon and has been working at the ACLU for the past 5 years.
Is that my cue?
You're up, Misha.
Okay. Hi, everybody. As you just heard, my name is Misha Isaak. I'm a partner at Perkins Coie. I'm enjoying my tea this afternoon in my Yas Queen RBG mug. As you heard, for the last 5 years until March 9th, I was a lawyer in the governor's office and was general counsel for the latter half of that time. When I decided to move on from the governor's office to be a partner at Perkins, I set my departure date for the day after the constitutional deadline of the short legislative session, March 9th. And I only mention that date because I don't know how many of you remember that week of March 9th, but it was basically on March 12th that the whole COVID-19 pandemic thing suddenly exploded. And we were all of a sudden talking about things like closing schools and stay-at-home orders. And I was lying on a beach in Puerto Vallarta on that day, and I'm pretty sure that if I had set my departure for a week later, I might still be Governor Brown's general counsel today. So I might be the luckiest person in the world that I just happened to set my departure date for that date. But I did want to emphasize that I am no longer affiliated with the governor's office, and lest anyone watching this or participating think that I'm speaking on behalf of Governor Brown or the governor's office, I am not. I'm my own person. I'm also not speaking on behalf of my firm, Perkins Coie, and I have no affiliation whatsoever with the Measure 107 campaign. I'm just knowledgeable about the measure because I was involved when it was conceptually being formulated by the governor and her staff and allies in the legislature, and then through the legislative process when it was being referred out to the voters. So what is Measure 107? Well, as I was Googling, what kind of others have talked about the measure and how others have described it, I thought that OPB's summary was apt when they said Measure 107 is a straightforward proposal with a complicated backstory. And that's absolutely right. So in short, here's what Measure 107 does. It amends the state constitution to allow limits on contributions to political campaigns, to allow limits on campaign expenditures, which are arguably unconstitutional under the federal constitution. And so it says in the text, allow those limits on expenditures to the extent allowed under the US Constitution. 3, to require public disclosure of campaign contributions and expenditures. And 4, to require political ads to disclose their, it allows the requirement of political ads to disclose their sponsors. So big picture, Measure 107 authorizes campaign finance laws. Just to be absolutely clear, here's what Measure 107 is not. Measure 107 does not itself impose limits on campaign contributions and expenditures. In other words, nothing actually changes right after Measure 107 passes, except that the legislature and local governments will have the power to impose campaign finance limits under the Oregon Constitution. Okay, so for folks who are not in the weeds on this issue, you might be asking, why is this even necessary? Don't we already have campaign finance laws in Oregon? And I think many Oregonians would be surprised to learn that actually, in many cases, we do not. Oregon is one of just 5 states that has no limits on campaign contributions. And so just as an illustration for folks who have donated money to political campaigns, under federal law, if you wanted to donate money to the campaign of Joe Biden or President Trump, for instance, I don't know why you would, but I mean, if you did, or Senator Merkley, you would be limited to a $2,800 cap per election per candidate. But in Oregon, many of you will recall that Oregon's wealthiest citizen, Phil Knight, just all by himself, donated $2.5 million to the campaign of Newt Buehler when he was running for governor 2 years ago against Governor Brown. And while that opened both Phil Knight and Newt Buehler to significant public criticism for donating such a huge amount of money from one person in one race, it was totally legal in Oregon. There was absolutely nothing illegal about it. So that's sort of the state of the law in Oregon, is that we have very robust disclosure requirements in the state. So we know exactly who is donating to political campaigns and how much they're donating, but there are no actual limits on those campaign donations in Oregon. So there's a reason for that, and here's the backstory. Way back in 1997, in a Oregon Supreme Court case called Van Natta versus Kiesling, the Supreme Court struck down campaign finance laws as violating the state constitution. So that's why we need a constitutional amendment now, because the Supreme Court back in 1997 said that campaign finance limits were unconstitutional. Now, there was a little bit of a twist earlier this year, because earlier this year, after Measure 107 already had been referred to the ballot by the state legislature, the Oregon Supreme Court revisited that 1997 decision and overruled it in part. In the case from earlier this year, the Oregon Supreme Court said that campaign contribution limits are not facially invalid under the free expression provision of the Oregon Constitution, but still could be challenged on an as-applied basis. Okay, so current law today in Oregon, based on the Oregon Supreme Court's most recent decision about the permissibility of campaign finance limitations, is that campaign contribution limits are probably constitutional today. They're probably permissible, but not necessarily. Because as I mentioned, the Oregon Supreme Court in its decision left open this window, which could be a pretty significant window, to say that campaign contribution limits are still susceptible to as applied challenges under the free expression clause of the Oregon Constitution. So that's why Measure 107, which was desperately, in my opinion, desperately necessary earlier this year, in my opinion, is still necessary, even after the recent Oregon Supreme Court decision, because what Measure 107 would do now is resolve the ambiguity that the recent Supreme Court decision has left with respect to whether campaign finance limits are constitutional. Basically, if Measure 107 passed, campaign contribution limits would be categorically constitutional, and it would just be up to the legislature and local governments to decide what those limits should be. Okay, so that is the legal backstory, but it is perhaps still worth considering whether we even need campaign finance limits. I think that conceptually, that's perhaps a harder question than many people realize. And I think there's a cogent argument to be made that as long as you have full public disclosure, then Phil Knight should be able to donate as much money as he wants to donate, and then the public can consider that when they're casting their ballots in that race. So like I said, that's an argument that certainly has merit as far as it goes. It's not my view. My view is that we have way too much money in our elections, and that the huge amount of money that we have in our elections has corrosive effects on our democracy. It has corrosive effects on public policy outcomes in state and local governments. And in my opinion, it's particularly unhealthy for our elections when we have such large amounts of money coming from a single source or from a small group of sources. And so that's basically the pitch. It's not particularly complicated. It comes down to the fact that, I'm supporting Measure 107 because I would like less money in politics. And I would like the legislature in its next legislative session to come up with a campaign finance restriction scheme that reduces the amount of money that anybody can contribute to a political campaign. Okay, that's it. Kelly?
Yeah, thanks, Misha. I guess I'll pick up where you left off and say, well, I'll first say I am speaking on behalf of my employer today, ACLU of Oregon. So these are not my personal opinions, but they are the opinions of our recently changed organizational policy. So ACLU also agrees with what Misha just said, which is there's way too much money in politics that is having harmful effects on our democracy right now. However, ACLU is opposed to Measure 107 because we don't think we need to amend our state constitution to get there. So the provision that will be amended is Article 2, Section 8. The language of Article 2, Section 8 says this, and let me just pull up the right tab and see if I don't have too many because I'm in crazy tab mode these days. So it currently reads, the Legislative Assembly shall enact laws to support the privilege of free suffrage, prescribing the manner of regulating and conducting elections, and prohibiting under adequate penalties all undue influence therein from power, bribery, tumult, and other improper conduct. We think that this provision provides the legislature with the authority that it needs to enact campaign finance laws, especially now that we have a decision from the Supreme Court changing the analysis under Article 1, Section 8, or our free expression clause. When I think about campaign finance, which quickly overwhelms my brain, I do think of these kind of three buckets that Misha laid out. So we have contributions, we have expenditures, we have disclosures. It is now not a facial, as Misha said, not a facial violation of our state constitution's free expression clause to limit the amount of campaign contributions. Losing my train of thought. Oh my gosh, give me a second here to reset. It's not unconstitutional. However, ACLU does think that there's still inherently expressive activity in making contributions to campaigns that should be protected. And I think with our constitutional structure right now, without this amendment, there's a balancing available to take those things into account. I think the constitutional balance analysis changes, though, with a later enacted provision to the Constitution. And so I think there's a risk to the expression in making campaign contributions with making a later enacted contribution. There's also, so I'm going to kind of skip over expenditures because we have the federal constitution that kind of makes that a non-issue right now because it's unconstitutional to limit expenditures under First Amendment. But let's then move to disclosures. So if you look at the language of the ballot measure on exactly what it would authorize for disclosures, it would authorize laws that could require the disclosure of contributions or expenditures made in connection with political campaigns. And that's a really big, to me, not very clear, there's not much limit to, I think, what types of disclosure laws we might be authorizing in allowing for or requiring disclosures made in connection with political campaigns. I think better language and so in this case recently that Misha mentioned with the Multnomah County ordinance, the language there was related to, and we raised a similar concern with that language too, so related to political campaigns. I think what it would be better language, stronger language would be in support of or opposition to a particular campaign, but I'm not sure even how one would ascertain what a lot of our work, whether a lot of our work, I should say, would be in connection to a political campaign. So I think we also are opposing, because of this disclosure provision, while we support very robust disclosure laws, this one seems to potentially threaten a lot of privacy concerns for donors. And so with that, I think noting the time here, I know we got started a little bit late, I might wrap up there and then let the Q&A resolve any further questions. So in short, I guess ACLU of Oregon opposes Measure 107 because we don't think we need a constitutional amendment to authorize the campaign finance laws, especially those that limit contributions. And we think it threatens privacy and how broad of authority it grants around disclosure laws.
Thanks, guys. We did get started a little bit late, but we're actually still on schedule. I haven't seen any questions come through yet, unless they've only come through to Cassandra. But if either of you have any further comments on this, feel free to continue talking. Otherwise, we can jump ahead to the next measures. All right, then.
If there are folks that have questions, we'll be around for the whole time. So
yeah, we can certainly take further questions at the very end of the program as well, too. So with that, I wanted to briefly measure ballot measure 108. We elected to skip a presentation on the ballot measure because of the broad bipartisan support for it. Not that there isn't opposition to this ballot measure. I am putting in the chat box a link to the voter's guide, which I'm sure you received in the mail, but you can find both the opposition and in favor arguments for all ballot measures in the voter's guide. But ballot measure 108, just to touch on it briefly, is a legislatively referred state statute that increases cigarette and cigar taxes, establishes a tax on e-cigarettes and nicotine vaping devices, and funds health programs. This measure, if passed, would bring Oregon's tax rate more in line with other Western states and create a taxation system for vaping products, of currently which there is none. So I'll go ahead on to ballot measure 109, which is an initiative being called the Oregon Psilocybin Services Act, which would allow for the manufacturing, delivery, administration of psilocybin at supervised licensed facilities. And with this, there is a 2-year development period. For a more in-depth overview, we have Dave Kopilak and Kathryn Tucker from the Emerge Law Group, an Oregon boutique law firm known for specializing in the cannabis industry. Dave is a co-founder of Emerge and is a business and corporate attorney and also one of the drafters of this ballot measure. Kathryn, who recently joined Emerge as a special counsel, co-chairs the firm's psychedelic practice group with Dave and has decades of experience advocating for the rights of terminally ill patients. We've also reserved some time for Kelly Simon to share the ACLU's position on the ballot measure, and again, for all presenters to take participant questions. So with that, Dave and Kathryn, go on ahead.
Dave, I think we've lost your audio. Still not there. It's not showing you as muted, but it's not coming through.
There's an arrow next to the mute button that says select a microphone. Maybe check what source you're on. No, we had you working earlier.
I think he's saying, Kathryn, if you want to go ahead and share a bit while he's working it out, that would work.
Sure. So Dave and I had, thanks for having us. We had agreed that he would spend a few minutes talking about the measure and then I would follow. But since he's having that problem, I'll just jump in. So this is a pioneering measure. Oregon has been out front in the past on pioneering measures. So this is exciting to see this measure addressing this important topic. A couple things just about the structure of the measure. Well, first, Oregon will be the first state to bring such a measure to voters. It is being closely watched nationwide, and it's very much part of what is sometimes called the psychedelic renaissance of research into the utility of these medicines for treatment of a range of conditions. Many of you may have seen Michael Pollan's award-winning book, How to Change Your Mind, which does a great overview of these different substances and the current generation of research and the findings. And I highly recommend that as a backgrounder if you're interested in this subject of psychedelic medicine and psilocybin as one of the psychedelics. So the measure, which is rather complex, establishes the Oregon Psilocybin Services Program, and it has a 2-year development period. In that 2-year period, there will be the convening of an Oregon Psilocybin Advisory Board appointed by the governor, which will work with Oregon Health Authority to establish health, safety, education, and training standards, develop best practices, and adopt rules for the implementation. So that's an important piece of this. It's a very carefully crafted measure that builds in time for all of these tasks to take place. So the measure also specifies who can obtain licenses to produce, process the medicine, and provide the therapeutic services. This measure very much contemplates a therapeutic use of psilocybin. And so there will be licensed and trained facilitators that do the therapy. They will be giving this therapy in licensed facilitation services centers. And the consumer or the person receiving the psilocybin We'll have a preparation session with the therapist, with the facilitator, an actual therapeutic administration session attended by the facilitator, and offered a third session for integration of what occurred during the administration. There will be no dispensaries, so the consumer would not be going to obtain the medication at a dispensary and then self-administering it alone at home or elsewhere. It all happens very much in a therapeutic setting at a licensed facility with a licensed facilitator. Data to be collected and reported, and the measure provides a safe harbor under state civil and criminal exposure. So that's kind of the structure of the measure. Why is it so important? Well, Oregon has a mental health crisis. There are 20% of Oregonians identified with mental health condition. Addiction has been declared a public health crisis by the governor in Oregon. Psilocybin has been shown to be safe and effective in treating addiction, as well as a variety of other mental health conditions, including depression, anxiety disorders, including PTSD, and that in particular with regard to veterans have found extraordinary relief with psilocybin therapy. And also a very effective application in relief of end-of-life psychological distress. So what you are seeing is a tremendous interest in this from the therapeutic community, and both the measure sponsors are themselves therapists, to bring a new tool into the toolbox for addressing serious mental health problems. I'm going to talk a little bit now, turning to what I had planned to talk about, which is the area of advocacy I've been active in for my 30 years in advocacy. And that is, how do we protect and expand the rights of dying patients, and how do we increase the choices available to dying patients so that they can have the kind of death that is most consistent with their preferences. So one of the things to those of us who work in that field that's been so exciting are the modern day studies about the efficacy of psilocybin therapy to relieve non-physical suffering in dying patients. So in my 30 years of work, I would say we've seen a lot of advance and progress in how do we treat the physical pain and suffering associated with terminal illness. And, you know, I've been very pleased and proud to be part of catalyzing some of those important changes. And yet the piece that is still missing with regard to end-of-life palliative care has been, how do we address non-physical suffering? And that's what's so exciting about the psilocybin studies, which are coming out of institutions, major research institutions like Johns Hopkins, NYU, UCLA, UCSF, and these very careful studies, which are published in the journals and readily available to any interested in looking at them, is that psychotherapy assisted with psilocybin significantly relieves anxiety and depression with no clinically significant adverse events. So I really invite you to take a look at those underlying studies. They're very compelling. The relief is immediate. And interestingly, the researchers have also looked at how enduring are the effects of the therapy, and finding that the therapeutic effect lasts many months, and in most cases, because we're talking about dying patients, until the patient has died. And so that patient has been able to be free of anxiety and depression as death approached. And that's just a tremendous benefit for terminally ill patients, particularly in a culture where medicine now does such a good job of keeping patients alive for so long and keeping death at bay, and yet many patients still suffer with anxiety and depression. So we are seeing the leaders in the palliative care and end-of-life care, the hospice care communities step forward in support of this exciting new palliative care tool. And one of the things that I like to kind of point out that maybe not everyone who doesn't work in end-of-life law and policy might not notice is, of course, Oregon was out front of the nation in enacting the first statewide initiative in 1994 that allows aid in dying, which is allowed under the Oregon Death with Dignity Act and is sometimes referred to as Death with Dignity. So dying patients in Oregon are able to choose to ingest controlled substances for the purpose of precipitating death. They're also allowed to access controlled substances for the purpose of eradicating consciousness. In the instance where they have unrelieved physical suffering, they can be sedated into unconsciousness in an intervention known as palliative sedation, where consciousness is eradicated by the medicine, food and fluid is withheld until death arrives. So isn't it appropriate to allow dying patients to access controlled substances for the purpose of elevating and expanding consciousness, which is the experience that patients have with psilocybin therapy? And I think one of the really interesting questions too is whether that would potentially impact how a patient feels about these other interventions. We don't know the answer to that yet. It's an interesting question for study. But I invite you to learn more about the measure. It is a very long measure. You can go to voteyesonone09.org, which is the campaign's website. It will have a tab that has the full text of the measure, as does your voters pamphlet. I encourage you, if this interests you, to drill down into looking at some of the underlying studies. They're absolutely fascinating, and another great resource for sort of general layperson reading is the Michael Pollan book, How to Change Your Mind. So I think with that, I'll leave it for questions, and if Dave has gotten his mic back on, if I missed anything that he might want to add. Still can't hear Dave. So maybe I'll take the questions. I hate it when technology fails us in this way, but happy
Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions just yet, but I'm happy to give Kelly some time to jump in if she wants to articulate the ACLU's position on this measure as well.
Sure, and it can be pretty quick on this one, but one thing the ACLU has seen, we saw this with marijuana, but that the way our country has engaged in the war on drugs has created a lot of barriers to exploring and learning about these very things that Kathryn was just discussing. It's really created government interference with potentially really important alternative therapies that could help people with the very debilitating conditions that Kathryn was also mentioning. I'm personally impacted by depression and anxiety, and I think, to the extent we can reduce barriers like this for care, it's a really valuable thing.
So we've had one question come up as to whether the research studies are collected in any one place for the public to access.
Oh, that's a great question. They're really not, although, I would say certainly Michael Pollan's book talks about all of them. And if you look to the most recent of the journal articles, they will, of course, be citing the preceding studies. So it's not intimidating. It's not a big research task. They're really easily accessible. And if anyone wants to shoot me an email following this, I'd be happy to share a list of those underlying articles.
Great, thanks. I've got another question as to what happens after the 2-year period.
Right. Well, that's the exciting moment where state law in Oregon would have permission under state law for psilocybin therapy to begin. so that entities that wanted to be involved with the production of the psilocybin, which of course, as you may know, the psilocybin mushroom grows in nature in Oregon. And so for those who want to grow, there will be opportunities to get a license to be a grower. There will be opportunities for those who are interested in providing the therapeutic service to take the training to become certified as a facilitator. There will be the opportunity to be licensed as a facilitation center. So all of that will then be possible. And then the individuals who think they would benefit from psilocybin therapy will be able to find the facilitators and the facilitation centers and begin to have this therapy. So it's really exciting. You know, I will flag, since this is a gathering of lawyers, that of course psilocybin is on Schedule 1 of both the state and federal Controlled Substances Act. So what that means is that it is not permissible under either state or federal law. And so the enactment of this measure would change state law. It would not, of course, change federal law. And in the federal law domain, it is, of course, possible that, as happened with cannabis, there would be an evolution of cooperative federalism where the federal authorities would essentially refrain from enforcement where a state had permitted and was permitting and licensing and regulating access to that controlled substance. So all of that, you know, of course, still remains to be seen.
So we've got a few more questions trickling in. One question ties back to what you were just talking about, facilitators. Who would be training the facilitators?
Right. Well, so that's very much left for this 2-year development period. And, you know, the question of what would be adequate training will certainly be contemplated in that 2-year development period. One of the things that is interesting, if you're following this emerging field at all, is there are quite a few trainings already being offered around the country. And so there's this tremendous excitement in the therapeutic community to already begin these trainings, so that as soon as the substances are legally available, the therapeutic use can begin. So there are a wide range of offerings already on the market. And I think one of the tasks for the Psilocybin Services Advisory Board, in conjunction with the OHA, will be to take a look at what is being offered, is it sufficient, and what should be required in Oregon.
Great. And another question, where do doctors fit in with the process, and why were they not made part of the process?
Well, right. So the idea in the measure, the way it's structured, is that a facilitator need not be a doctor. So there is a requirement for completion and licensure of the facilitator, but it doesn't require a particular other professional credential. From what I have had in discussion with my colleagues who are physicians who treat dying patients, many of whom have spoken in support of the measure. And by the way, of course, one thing that often interests voters is to see who has supported a measure. And on the Yes on 109 website, there is a list of endorsements, which of course includes the ACLU's important endorsement, but also a great number of other organizations, and then a great population of physicians and clinicians of a variety who support the measure. But what my physician colleagues tell me is that for their terminally ill patients who might benefit from psilocybin therapy, they will probably be referring those patients, when it is time to do so, to a facilitator who also holds some other professional credential, whether it is a social work credential or a psychotherapy credential, or a physician psychiatry credential, because for dying patients in particular who may have a very complex medical situation, having a more highly trained facilitator would be indicated and preferable. But that's not necessarily the case for people who are not confronted with terminal illness and the medical complexity of that situation.
Okay, looks like we've got another question here. And, you know, I just know that this is probably a ways off from my own research, but how do you anticipate engaging insurance providers and providing coverages for these therapies?
Yeah, that is off in the future, although it may very well be part of what is addressed in the 2-year period. One of the things that's so absolutely fascinating about these therapies, and this is true whether we're talking about relief of anxiety and depression in dying patients, or whether we're talking about relief of disabling PTSD in combat veterans, is the studies have shown that even a single guided therapeutic session has dramatic response and dramatic efficacy. So one of the things that I will expect insurers to be very excited about is these are not long-term expensive therapies. These are therapies that yield benefit at the first session, oftentimes. So it may be that one of the greatest proponents as these therapies come online will be insurers who would like to minimize and reduce the cost of therapy.
Great, thanks. I had a question that I'm not exactly sure. I think he was tying back to a statement you had, the name of the most recent article. Sorry if that was like 10 minutes ago for you, Kathryn.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I say, I'd be very happy to send a citation list.
Okay.
You know, I'm looking at a 2016 article in the Journal of Psychopharmacology. That's quite recent. There were 2 articles in 2016 in the Journal of Psychopharmacology. So I'm happy to send follow-up citations, and anyone can reach me at Kathryn@emergelawgroup.com, and I'm happy to send a citation list. There's also a really fascinating, for those that are really nerdy, an investigator's brochure available online by USONA Institute, which is providing the psilocybin in these ongoing studies. And you can just Google USONA Institute Investigator Brochure Psilocybin, and it will take you the most current version of that. Just came out in August 2020. And it is a wealth of the scientific information.
Great, thank you so much. I don't know if Dave ever got his sound working and has anything to add, or if Kelly has anything further to add on this topic. Not seeing any new questions that we haven't answered, or at least touched on.
We still can't hear you, Dave.
I'm sorry, Dave.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And we've got one more ballot measure to go through, ballot measure 110. It's another initiative being called the Drug Addiction and Treatment Act, which would provide statewide addiction and recovery services partially financed by marijuana taxes, and reclassify personal non-commercial possession of certain drugs under a specified amount. For a more in-depth overview, we have Mia Getland from Gleam Law, which is a West Coast cannabis boutique law firm. Mia has a general business law practice serving a wide variety of cannabis industry clients in entity formation, licensing, and operations. And again, we've also reserved some time for Kelly Simon to share the ACLU's position on this ballot measure. And we will be taking more questions in the question and answer box.
Hey, hi everyone. I'm Mia. I'm Oregon partner of Gleam Law. Unlike some of the other panelists today, I'm not personally involved with this ballot initiative. So I'm not going to be advocating for or against it or providing my personal opinions. Instead, I plan to first talk about what it would do if passed, then the importance of its goals, and then the arguments given by its opponents. And as a bit of foreshadowing, the opposition to this measure is somewhat surprising and interesting, so I'll spend a fair amount of time talking about that. So first of all, as the name suggests, the Drug Decriminalization and Addiction Treatment Initiative has two parts: decriminalization and addiction treatment. First, it would decriminalize possession for personal use of Schedule 1 through 4 drugs, providing for a penalty of $100 or a completed health assessment through the treatment program. Second, it would establish the Drug Treatment and Recovery Service Fund, which would fund agencies and organizations to create addiction recovery centers. These centers would do at a minimum the following: 24-hour day, 7-day-a-week triage of clients' needs for immediate medical and other treatment, comprehensive behavioral health needs assessments, individual intervention plans, which would address substance abuse disorder treatment, coexisting health problems, housing, employment, childcare, and other issues that clients face, peer support, and virtual outreach services. The funding would come from savings to the state from implementing the act, from reductions in arrest, incarceration, and official supervision, state grants, and the Oregon marijuana account. So that's what it would do. It was brought by the Drug Policy Alliance, which is a New York-based group with the goal of ending the war on drugs. And it addresses some really pressing concerns, both on the national level and especially here in Oregon. Oregon is among the worst states in terms of addiction recovery services. And also then in the context of the BLM movement and the larger movement, the war on drugs, of course, has a well-known, significantly outsized adverse impact on communities of colors. And whether this initiative fails or succeeds, the legislature will have to address these issues, either by taking this act, fine-tuning it, and implementing it, or by taking separate legislative action. And then the opponents, there's the obvious ones like Law and Order and conservative groups, and I don't think I think their reasons are probably pretty obvious and I don't need to go through them. But some opponents are quite surprising at first glance because they generally work towards the same goals that this initiative seeks to accomplish. And some of them are the Urban League of Portland, Oregon Recovers, Oregon Council for Behavioral Health, and some other recovery and social justice groups. And some of their arguments are as follows. The drug policy, they argue that the Drug Policy Alliance is not working closely enough with existing treatment and recovery groups and with communities of color and other communities that have been particularly adversely impacted by the war on drugs. That it doesn't address problems in Oregon's addiction and recovery system, and that rather than working to build on and improve the existing structure for recovery treatment in Oregon, it's instead setting up a new one, which would presumably have its own kinks and possibly lead to a gap in availability of services while that one is being implemented. There's also an argument that the backlash from conservative law and order groups risks dismantling the work done to change the narrative about addiction. And then another issues that opponents are talking about is the funding. Oregon has built broad economies around alcohol and more recently cannabis. And Oregon Recovers, which is one of the groups opposing this initiative, is opposed at least in part, if not largely, because it has been working for years to develop a climate to be able to pass a stable tax on alcohol to address these issues. And they fear that this initiative undercuts those efforts, which the alcohol industry has seized on, since of course it would get them out of the taxes they were likely facing. It instead takes funds from the Oregon marijuana account. It would take everything over $11.25 million per quarter or $45 million annually from marijuana taxes. The account brought in over $133 million for the 2020 fiscal year, and that has been increasing consistently year over year and is expected to continue increasing. So it currently means that this would be taking about 2/3 of the funds. Right now, the funds go to cities and counties, state school fund, mental health, alcoholism and drug services, and state police. So, and opponents argue that because cannabis funding is, and I believe this is accurate, the only growing revenue source in the state, and if somebody knows that to be inaccurate, please comment and correct me. This cuts off what would otherwise be increases in funding to programs that are already underfunded and facing a recession and other financial effects of COVID, where there aren't likely to be additional funds elsewhere for those programs. So, you know, again, I said I think that the opposition to this is pretty interesting because of who some of the groups opposing it are, and because it creates an uncomfortable dynamic because with the exception of the conservative and law and order opponents, most of the opponents are actually working towards generally the same goals as the proponents and very strongly support decriminalization, improved addiction services, and redressing or at least putting a stop to ongoing impact of criminalization on communities of color and other disadvantaged groups. But the groups disagree about how to get there. So, and this is expected to pass, which I think is going to be really interesting, at least for me, to see how the legislature handles it. I think we can expect some fine tuning and tweaking, and hopefully it ends up somewhere that achieves its goals, does all of the good while also addressing some of the concerns that some of the opponents have. In any respect, the conversations about complete and wraparound recovery services and criminal justice reform are great, as is the pressure on the legislature to take action. And again, I mean, I expect this to pass, but if it doesn't, then I think these conversations are going to really put pressure on the legislature to take legislative action. And that's it. I'll pass it over to Kelly.
Here we go. It's me again. So it probably won't surprise folks listening that the ACLU is supporting this measure. In full disclosure, we have made campaign contributions in support of this campaign, and for reasons consistent with that Mia has laid out. We know that the war on drugs has destroyed so many lives, and a disproportionate number of those have been the lives of Black people and Indigenous people and other people of color. The concerns that were flagged about how closely the campaign has been working with communities of color are concerns we take very seriously, in our board in supporting this measure has committed to ensuring that in the implementation moving forward, that work is done in close connection with communities of color. Oregon has incredible racial disparities in the arrest of people for possession of controlled substances for personal use amounts. The Criminal Justice Commission actually did a study about what the impact would be if this measure passed on those racial disparities. And they found that Measure 110 would significantly reduce racial disparities, in fact, by 95% should it pass. I think that's an incredibly important goal of this measure. Oregon also ranks nearly last in access to drug addiction treatment for those who need it. According to some resources, nearly 2 people die every day from drug overdoses. And this measure would direct millions of marijuana tax dollars into expanded access to low barrier and culturally responsive treatment and recovery services across Oregon. So I think it's a really exciting measure, and it's a it's exciting because it also gives Oregon a chance to be a leader in a new way at a moment where we're calling for a new vision for public safety, and shifting our mindset from punishment to public health. This measure does exactly that, and it approaches drug addiction with a health-based mindset and a treatment-first approach that gets us out of this kind of failed tough on crime, war on drugs way of thinking that we've seen doesn't work.
Thanks, both of you. I'm not seeing any questions on this just yet. I didn't know if anybody had any questions on this ballot measure. We're also open to taking questions on anything that we've discussed today. It looks like all the panelists are still around. Give that a minute. Can you speak to the concerns opponents have with regard to this measure adding unnecessary bureaucracy and red tape? It's up for grabs.
I would have to do a little research into that. I don't think I can speak intelligently enough on it. But I am happy to respond after by email if I get the email address of who asked the question. Unless Kelly has an answer to that.
I also can't speak to the kind of ins and outs of the bureaucracy that would happen. But what I can say is that the burden of our criminal justice system that we would be left with if we don't make these changes is certainly one I think to be concerned about.
Here's another question. Where does the Drug Policy Alliance get its funding?
Let me drop, I have some information on this. Let me see if I can find it. That's another one I want to follow up on, if that's okay. I know they have, my understanding is that it's mostly out of state funding. I think a lot on the East Coast, but I don't want to speak to many specifics without pulling it up. Actually, I had the research on my laptop. I'm going to drop though in the comments their website.
Okay.
Which might help a little bit. And then if I get that email, I can, once I get home, I can pull it off of my laptop and provide it.
Okay. Whoever asked that, if you want to shoot out your email address, whoever asked that question can contact you directly then if they want to follow up with you on that. Got a few more questions rolling in. A friend said this measure provides assessment, but that is different than treatment. Will there be addiction treatment as well?
My understanding is yes. The recovery centers, the addiction recovery centers, are designed to provide comprehensive, not just assessment, but then an intervention plan to address the substance abuse disorder, other health problems, and then the other problems that people facing addiction often face, such as housing insecurity, unemployment, childcare issues, etc.
It says, and I'm not sure where, maybe in the voter's guide, that it will use the savings from reduction in arrest, incarceration, and supervision resulting from the measure. How much is that estimated to be roughly? So go ahead.
I haven't seen anything on that. The detailed funding source seems to be the Oregon marijuana account, which is the one that, of course, raises concerns of a lot of opponents. And as I touched on, I mean, that's going to be pretty darn significant since it would be everything over $45 million per year, and it was for the last fiscal year $133 million, and I believe the year before was about $105 million, and the year before I think 80 something. Might be a little off on that, but that's going to be a lot of money. So my guess is that that's the primary source of funding that they're relying on.
Okay. There was a long list of opponents to this measure. Even if proponents like the ACLU commit to working more closely with local groups in the implementation of this measure, isn't it a problem that this didn't happen in the formation of the measure itself? I guess that one's for you, Kelly.
Yeah, I think anytime that you don't work closely with communities of color on issues that impact them, it's a miss. Yeah.
Is personal use amount defined for each drug? Someone's reading the.
Yes, it is. Let me pull that up. If you won't go to the next question, I'll pull it up.
Okay. So the next question goes back to the prior question, and I assume it's the one before. Can the fund monies be used when there are referrals for treatments as opposed to just for the assessment and developing implementation plans? And if you're still looking for the prior question, I can ask that one again.
Yeah, I'm not sure the answer to this one.
I don't know the answer to that either.
Okay. Well, hopefully the answers are somewhere. So we're still looking for the personal use amount. And I don't see any other questions. I'm sorry if we weren't able to answer some of the questions live. There is, a slew of information online in the voters pamphlet and on websites for proponents of the measure.
Okay. So well, I'm gonna so it looks like hold on a second. So 2 grams, under 2 grams of cocaine. I'm going to go through some of these. I don't know if we care about all of them. Same for methamphetamines. It is under 12 grams or more of a mixture or substance containing detectable amounts of psilocybin. 40 or more, well, under 40 user units of a mixture of substance containing detectable amounts of LSD. I don't know what a user unit is. Like what's that's defined as.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you're looking at a link that we can drop in the comments.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just,
yeah,
I can. Yeah, and I'll drop it in because there's a bunch of different drugs on it. 40 or under 40 units of methadone. So yeah, I'll drop it in. It's just the text of the bill, or the ballot measure.
Right. One more question just came in. Will this measure have any retroactive impact on folks who are currently incarcerated?
There's no part, there's nothing in the ballot measure that would address past convictions or incarcerations.
All right. I'm not seeing any more questions, and I apologize if we were unable to fully answer some of the questions that came in. But I think that's all we have for today. I would especially like to thank my colleagues from the Oregon State Bar Cannabis Law section for sharing some of your time this afternoon. Thanks as well to Misha and Kelly. Please be sure to vote early and vote the entire ballot. Thank you. Have a great day.